The rainy summer has quieted down since early August. Is it going to be a quiet fall, or is the late hurricane season going to be active? Jeff and Josh will join me to address this issue in the Southeast U.S. edition of the Water Resources Outlook.
So let's talk about past rainfall first, and we see the past 30 days departure from normal. And so far, September has been fairly dry across the southeast. Quite a difference compared to the June through August months. But the weather pattern has settled down here, which is typical, and we've not had any real threat of tropical weather, and thus dry weather has been the result. Looking back now at the past 90 days, and we see quite a few areas that have been wet from the western section of Florida to most of Georgia and South Carolina, as well as western portions of North Carolina, all very wet this summer. Interesting to point out how dry it actually has been across the eastern Florida peninsula, especially relative to how wet other parts of Florida have been. So it has been a wet summer, but how wet has it been? Well, for the southeast, this has been the wettest summer period, June through August, in 119 years of record. The wettest summer prior to this summer was back in 2003, which was also a neutral ENSO year, as a matter of fact. This summer's wet weather really shattered the old record in 2003 by a considerable amount, as you can see there in the table. So it has been a wet one for the southeast, and it also has been a wet summer looking at June through August for Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina. All the wettest summers for those three states, third wettest in North Carolina, and fifth wettest in Alabama. For Georgia, the wet period June through August broke the old record set back in 1994. That's when Alberto and Beryl hit in July and August of that year, respectively. For South Carolina, the wet period broke the old record set back in 1964, which was an active tropical season for South Carolina that year, and Florida topped its wettest June through August from 2012. So back-to-back very wet summers across Florida. A couple of items to point out here is how wet we've been, even though the tropical season has not been that active. And for Florida, though they have been wet there, is quite a bit of spatial variation. Many places getting hit with plenty of rain, but as we saw in the earlier slide, some areas of the eastern part of the peninsula very dry the past few months. So how has all this translated to stream flows? We see the past 14 days here, which gives us a general state of the stream flows. And normal is the rule across the southeast. A few basins in the Broad and Catawba rivers up there in North Carolina running a bit higher, but for the most part we've come down from the above normal stream flows in midsummer and now back to near normal with the past few weeks of relatively dry weather and below normal rainfall. Drought-wise, drought's still not a factor with the wet weather being so prevalent this summer, and so very little drought so far in the southeast. And finally, to see where we are at in terms of tropical systems and looking at those that affected the southeast U.S., the only tropical system was Andrea that had played a role in the southeast rainfall this summer. And this is very interesting to see how wet we've been with such little tropical activity and a neutral ENSO phase and a record wet weather for the southeast during this June through August period.
Let's start with a short and midterm outlook, which takes us through Tuesday, October 1st. Beginning with a basic flow aloft on September 25th, you see a pretty potent shortwave across the Ohio River Valley, and forcing associated with that shortwave will help to enhance precipitation across the western Carolinas and portions of North Georgia. We also have a stationary boundary across the Florida Panhandle. So along and south of that stationary boundary in the Florida Peninsula, we have pretty deep tropical moisture in place, and that will help to produce fairly widespread moderate precipitation across the peninsula. Fortunately, forcing is weak across that area, so we shouldn't expect widespread heavy rainfall. The basic flow aloft on September 28th shows that the shortwave trough that we had talked about earlier has now since moved off the eastern seaboard, and we have a ridge starting to take over the eastern two-thirds of the United States. So that'll help to quiet our conditions significantly behind this system. We also will have a possible non-tropical low develop. According to the model guidance, it might develop somewhere on the eastern shores or just to the east of North Carolina and Virginia. And the model guidance does suggest that it might retrograde or move a little bit west towards the coastline before finally turning out to sea. So there might be some enhanced precipitation in portions of southeast Virginia and northeast North Carolina associated with that low, but right now we're not expecting any significant precipitation from that system. In any case, most of the area should remain fairly dry. And finally, as we go towards October 1st, you see that ridge that we were talking about has since moved off the eastern seaboard, and we have another weak trough taking its place. This trough looks more significant than it really will be because it won't be working with a lot of moisture, so we're not expecting a lot of precipitation associated with this particular trough towards October 1st. So the bottom line through the period is that we begin with an active pattern early. The amplified ridge over the eastern United States will really quiet us down and make things more reminiscent of a typical October. So going forward into the total basin precipitation for the first week, you can see that we're really not expecting any significant rainfall. The most significant rainfall should be across Florida, where we do have higher confidence that we'll see widespread moderate rainfall, with basin average totals probably topping out at about 1.5 inches. Further north, where we were talking about the forcing from the shortwave trough, we are expecting potentially scattered to widespread moderate rainfall in northwest South Carolina and portions of western North Carolina, and maybe even portions of northern Georgia. But confidence there is a little bit lower due to the model guidance at this time. Everywhere else across the area, probably mostly widespread light precipitation, although there might be some thunderstorms or some weak convection in portions of Alabama and Georgia as this shortwave trough moves through. So we might see some isolated moderate totals there as well. So the bottom line through the total basin precipitation of the first week is that, again, the early period system will just bring some modest rain, and then, again, we get much quieter and drier. So the long-term outlook, which takes us through the first full week of October, you can start to see a pattern that might be a little bit more reminiscent, again, of October. So on October 2nd, the basic flow aloft shows yet another ridge starting to work its way into the southeast United States, with the trough that we had talked about towards the end of the short term moving off the eastern seaboard. So again, a pretty progressive pattern, trough ridge kind of orientation. As we go forward into the basic flow aloft on October 8th, towards the end of the long-term outlook, you see again another trough coming in, and this trough, according to the model guidance right now, looks to be a little bit more significant. It is a long wave trough, even some signs that it might close off. We may actually have an upper level low associated with it across the mid-Mississippi River Valley. And again, this is sort of more reminiscent of a fall kind of pattern. When the jet stream starts to work its way further to the south towards our area, we start to get a little bit more active of a storm track. We start to see more significant widespread precipitation. So we're going to start to see these kinds of patterns, I think, develop over the course of October, and especially as we go into November. But overall, for that long term, that second week period, we're really still not expecting a lot of precip. The moderate precip that you see across Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi, it's going to be associated with that last trough we just talked about. And so there's a lot of uncertainty still that far out with the model guidance as to just how much precip we will see. And eventually that trough will swing through past October 8th and encompass the entire southeast. So we might see a decent widespread moderate rainfall event from that trough if the model guidance is even remotely correct right now. So the bottom line through the period, through that second week, is that average to below normal rainfall will persist into what is typically a very dry October.
So now that Josh has addressed the short-term and the medium-term forecast, I'm going to address a little bit about what Jeff addressed, from the past, and a little bit about what we're expecting in the future. Volcanic eruptions is one thing that might be impacting our weather. The Browning newsletter is something that we read on a regular basis, and they've suggested that eruptions over the last couple of years have impacted our weather. The 2011 eruption of Mount Grímsvötn in Iceland was one that might impact it, and the other one in 2011 was the Sheveluch volcano in Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. They both erupted during that time and dispersed much volcanic ash way high in the atmosphere. And this has affected the polar jet stream and all those things. And we recently, on June 26th of this year, had another large eruption that put ash several miles into the air. So they've suggested that this might be impacting the circulation around the polar ice cap and has been impacting our weather. Now, we've been in neutral conditions for the last year, as Jeff mentioned before, and it's been in neutral conditions also that we've had some of our wettest time period. So between the two things, that's probably had a lot of impact on our past weather, and it's what we're at least look at as we go forward in our future weather. We mentioned that Josh didn't really have a whole lot to say about the tropical season because it still looks like it's going to stay fairly inactive, and that's why our October forecast looks like we have equal chances for above normal, near normal, or below normal rainfall. Really, there's nothing to lean us one way or the other. With the inactive season, it looks like it'll be more frontal type things that push through the area. And again, Josh mentioned that it looks like we could be more active as we get into early October and just a little bit more active with the frontal systems. As for the October, November, and December seasonal forecast, again, equal chances. Right now, there's nothing to lean us one way or the other. Again, with no clear La Nina or El Nino going forward, more neutral conditions, there's nothing to push us one way or the other. So we could go either way right now. But right now, that looks pretty good for what we're looking for late in this year. And as for the 3-month outlook for the beginning of next year, January, February, and March, the models are hinting at this. We look at the models that the Climate Prediction Center looks at, and some of those models are hinting at a little bit drier conditions over the central part of the southeast. South Georgia, coastal Carolinas, Florida, they're hinting at that. Again, it's very early. We're a long ways away from that, but with neutral conditions, the only thing they have to hang their hat on really is those models. So we'll be watching this fairly closely. In the middle of October, we'll be able to see a new forecast, and maybe there'll be a hint of one way or the other that we can see that might be the same or it might be different. So the bottom line for the southeast, well, it's been an end to a quiet tropical season. Even though we've been very rainy, it looks like our tropical season will end with kind of a whimper, kind of like the rest of the season. Again, there is still a chance we could see a storm pop up in the Gulf of Mexico, something like that. There is still that potential, but right now we're not looking for that to happen. As we move out of fall, late fall, and into early winter, normal rainfall is expected. Maybe as we get into the new year, things might back off a little bit, but it does look like we're normal at least for the rest of the year, which means we could still see some flooding throughout the rest of the fall. Our next water resources outlook will be on October 10th, 2013. Thank you for listening to this week's edition of the Water Resources Outlook. Remember, you can find much of this information at our website at weather.gov/SERFC. Also, come and visit our Facebook page where we will provide notifications of products we issue. Also, feel free to comment and pass that information along. And if you have any questions or comments, please contact me at the email address todd.hamel@noaa.gov.